Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
If you watched a lot of bad 70s cop shows, the show was an hour long. So what would happen is they'd spend the first, 45 minutes of the drama trying to figure out who done it. And then as they wrapped it up, they realized just figuring out who did it's not going to end this very well. So quite often the bad guy would be revealed and then he'd die. He'd get in a shootout with the cops, or he'd be in a car accident or some tragic thing. But that would be dramatic justice, the fact that somebody just happened to expire right at the end of the show and the credits would roll. That's how Hollywood solved the problem. So we got a great story here that ends in a similar way, but there's actually a bizarre twist to this. And BK sent me the story, so Steve, to check this out. It's from Detroit, WDIV, Channel 4. Click on Detroit.com. And a manhunt for an accused murderer ended when police discovered the suspect was in the Wayne County morgue the entire time. He wasn't hiding there. He was in the inventory. So why did he go unidentified for 2 months is the question asked by reporter Karen Drew, who wrote the story. The manhunt for the accused murderer came to an end when the police discovered he'd been in the Wayne County morgue for the last 2 months. Now, the Wayne County Medical Examiner's Office didn't check the fingerprints on the man and said that's not their job. They said, we don't ID him, we just handle him. Well, other experts are weighing in saying that it actually is the medical examiner's job to identify bodies and that a big mistake had been made. The story starts with the murder of a 40-year-old man in Farmington Hills, which is a suburb of Detroit. I had an office there for many years. Police said the victim identified his friend as the shooter before he died from his injuries. Now, some people are going to ask, Steve, how admissible would that be? Believe it or not, there are exceptions to the hearsay rule about a dying declaration, but they've got to be made under very, very specific circumstances. So the question about whether or not you could introduce into evidence a statement made by someone outside of court who has now passed away, it's possible, but if nothing else, you could use that to try to track this guy down and then try to prove it some other way. But he did say, I tell you now, the other guy that I'm talking about did this to me. And then the victim died. The man's fiancée said, about 4:30 that morning, I heard a big bang. I yelled out his name. I reached out. He wasn't there. I yelled out his name, and that's when he said, call the police, and then someone had shot him. She said she saw the victim on the floor, and the front door was shattered. Police said their investigation led them to believe the gunman shot his girlfriend in Detroit and then went to Farmington Hills to shoot the victim in this case. U.S. Marshal Aaron Garcia said during the manhunt, you are going to get caught. You can come in and surrender, or we are going to have to find you. Sources told Local 4 that countless man-hours and taxpayer money went into the search for the suspect. The Local 4 defenders learned that U.S. Marshals searched Michigan and traveled to Kentucky and Mississippi in attempts to track the accused killer down. Those searching for more did not know that his body had been inside the Wayne County morgue for quite some time. His body was transported to the morgue there just hours after the man who'd been murdered in the case we're talking about had been shot. His body was recovered from the Detroit River and believed to have been death by suicide. So it looks like he went up to Farmington Hills, shot somebody, came back down to Detroit, and killed himself. His body winds up in the morgue, and while he's chilling in the morgue, authorities are racing around the country looking for him. The man was a convicted felon. He had a criminal record. If the medical examiner had checked, fingerprints would have revealed his identity. A statement from Michigan Medicine said that morgue employees do not do fingerprinting, however. Michigan Medicine gets paid $31 million to run the morgue, and they just simply said it's not their job. They have great sympathy for any family who has experienced a delay in receiving information about a deceased relative or friend at the Wayne County morgue. We strive to do our best to care for every deceased person at the morgue and to serve their surviving families and friends with respect. That's what they said. Michigan Medicine is fully committed to reviewing issues with identifying deceased individuals at the Wayne County morgue and has investigated the case of this man from whom fingerprints could not be obtained by law enforcement officers at the scene. So they're blaming the police officers. Wayne County morgue employees do not do fingerprinting, which is handled by law enforcement experts with access to the databases needed for fingerprint identification. As part of our continuous improvement efforts, we have been actively working on a number of recommendations to the county, including that we hire a full-time employee dedicated to identifying individuals, in addition to other investments to improve identification of decedents in the medical examiner's office. Now, since Michigan Medicine assumed responsibility for the morgue in Wayne County, which was 2011, great strides have been made in morgue operations and many improvements implemented. We fully intend to continue to improve because even one problem in identifying a loved one's deceased relative is too many. So they say, look, it's not our job. Someone else's job. The police are the ones who brought us the body. Why didn't they do it? Okay? But Dr. Dragovich, who is the chief medical examiner at the Oakland County Medical Examiner's Office, which is one county to the north of Wayne County, said that while it is common sense to check fingerprints if you can't identify a body, it is not always done. He said it is the duty of the medical examiner to positively identify any victims that come into the morgue under their jurisdiction. He said while it's not specified, if you can't identify a body, then fingerprints should be checked as part of due diligence. So what he's saying is, look, there's no rule that says you must check fingerprints, but it is your job to figure out who they are. And so if who they are can only be determined from fingerprints, then that's probably the route you need to go down. These issues at the Wayne County Morgue have others wondering what else has been missed. Police sources have told Local 4 they're considering going to the morgue to look for bodies connected with some of their other unsolved cases. And I would shudder to think how many bodies they've got down there right now that are unidentified, because it sounds like there might be more. And I suspect there probably are always a few down there, and they should be doing what they can. Now, I actually know quite a bit about medical examiners, believe it or not, because I wrote a book about a situation where 73 people died in one evening on Christmas Eve, 1913. Book's called Death's Door, about the Italian Hall disaster. And there was a medical examiner, which back then was called the coroner. And the coroner was the person whose job it was to determine the causes of death for people who died in a medically unattended fashion. And so these people did not die in the hospital. They died at the Italian Hall, so medical examiner, the coroner, had to come in and determine the causes of death. He screwed the job up really, really badly. And he screwed the job up so badly that I was kind of shocked by it. And I spent quite a bit of time not just writing about it in the book, but researching it, trying to figure out what's going on here. And what's interesting about the coroner's position, and I'm talking about the coroner, which what they used to call, what are now the medical examiners. The coroner, you might realize, has the same root word as corona, which comes from the Latin word for crown. And in England, in the old days, where we got our common law from here in the U.S., in the old days, the crown had a very, what should we call it, a vested interest in how people died. Because depending on how you died, your stuff might go to your kids or it might go to the crown. So the coroner was somebody designated by the king who would travel around whenever somebody died in a way that seemed mildly suspicious. The coroner would come in on behalf of the king and try to determine the cause of death. And how they ruled the cause of death became very, very important because it often determined where land went and where property went. Stuff, property. So in America, the coroner's job was to determine the cause of death because death certificates, at least back in 1913, said you had to identify whether the death was natural causes or whether it was accidental, homicidal, or suicidal. Okay, which are the non-natural ways in which you can die. And those are the three classifications that the state of Michigan told coroners, you must pick one of these three. So if they died in a medically unattended setting, the coroner would then come in and say, okay, it was either homicide, suicide, or an accident. Pick one. And on the 73 death certificates at the Italian Hall, the coroner picked none of them because he didn't want to call it homicide, because then he'd have to go after the people who did it. Couldn't call it suicide because it wasn't suicide. And he didn't want to call it accident because too many people knew it wasn't an accident. So he just casually left all 73 death certificates blank on that one section and turned them all in. And it turns out that back then, nobody would question you if you turned in death certificates that had things missing on them, especially when you turned in a stack of 73 at one time. So I've actually gone and examined the 73 death certificates. I've examined the book that keeps all these records. I've examined all that stuff. It's an astounding bit of history in Michigan But getting back to the job of the medical examiner, the medical examiner's job is to determine the cause of death, generally speaking, for people whose deaths were not natural. And it's either somebody dies in a hospital and there's a doctor who can say, yeah, I was right there. This is what they died from. Doctor can sign the death certificate. But somebody dies someplace else. Then the medical examiner's got to look at it and say, okay, this person clearly died from, and they fill it out on the death certificate. And so you can't fill out a death certificate unless you know who the person is. Now, I understand you can fill a death certificate, as John Doe, or Jane Doe, or Mary Doe, whatever. You can do that, but it's not very useful. And so you would need to identify the person to attach a cause of death to them. And I know this is all very, very strange to be discussing this, but unfortunately, it is a fact of life, ironically. So it's a very strange case because the man was being manhunted. He was the subject of a manhunt. And pretty much the entire time, he's laying in the Wayne County morgue. And so it does seem like they should try to identify people there a little bit more quickly. And instead of saying, hey, that's not our job, they should say, you know something, let's work on that. How about that? So it's from WDIV, Channel 4. Click on Detroit.com. Karen Drew wrote it. BK sent it. Thanks a lot. Manhunt for accused murderer ends when police discover the suspect was in the Wayne County morgue the entire time. Questions or comments, put them below. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. At the peak of happiness, we stop thinking. Instead, we find peace.